Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
The State of Energy with Wyoming State Treasurer Mark Gordon.
A deep dive into what happened to coal, as well as the future of low-carbon technology.
Plus economic historian Samuel Western. It's all next on Wyoming Chronicle. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Wyoming PBS. Almost a year ago, Moses Naim, a contributing editor for The Atlantic, opened his article titled The Hidden Effects of Cheap Oil this way. What do Russia, ExxonMobil, and ISIS have in common? Not much, except that they're all grappling with an inconvenient but incontrovertible truth. A sudden, significant, and prolonged shift in the price of oil changes the world. For those of us who call the cowboy state home, falling oil prices are changing our world too. In 2014, Wyoming received $322 million from crude oil mineral severance taxes. Cut that in half for 2016, said the January Consensus Revenue Estimating Group's report. Its projection for this year, $163 million. The state's general fund revenue in 2015 was $1.5 billion. Projected this year, $1 billion, according to that same Craig report, which uses adjectives like pessimistic when assessing the state's short-term revenue outlook. Read the report and it's crystal clear. It has been, and is today, all about energy. In this Inside Energy Wyoming Chronicle special, we want to take a look at the state of energy here in Wyoming.
And I'm Lee Patterson with Inside Energy. We're a journalism startup reporting on energy issues in the West. And these changes are not just about the low price of oil. The coal industry, too, is in flux nationwide. Demand is falling, and some of the largest coal companies in the country have filed for bankruptcy over the past year. These trends are and will continue to have a particularly big impact here because nearly 40% of U.S. coal comes from the Powder River Basin. In fact, in 1988, Wyoming passed over Kentucky to become the country's #1 coal-producing state and has stayed there ever since. In this Wyoming Chronicle special, we will consider factors like low natural gas prices and regulations to try and get to the bottom of why the coal industry is changing so rapidly. And then we'll look into the future at some of the innovations that could keep Wyoming coal on the market.
At the end of the program, we'll visit with Samuel Western, a Wyoming writer who specializes in economic history. We'll ask him to articulate his views on Wyoming's economy today and in the long term. And we'll learn what his advice might be for decision makers challenged with declining revenues and the task of keeping Wyoming vital. So let's begin. We'll open with a visit with State Treasurer Mark Gordon. On the eve of the 2016 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature, I asked Treasurer Gordon about his insights into Wyoming's falling revenues because of the current energy bust and whether he believes, as some do, that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, Craig, I'm Mark Gordon, the Treasurer of the State of Wyoming, and we have a lot of information that comes in about energy, and it's not a surprise that oil's prices are down substantially. I think from the January Craig report, they're down even more, maybe almost twice as much. I think, what was it, a few days ago, we were in the range of $28 oil. Gas is even more challenged. That's been had a dramatic effect on our revenues. We see that across the spectrum from sales and use receipts that come back in. We see it from the federal mineral royalties and, of course, the severance tax revenues. You see that with coal, which has a lot of challenges at this point. This administration has put a target on coal. And that has been a huge challenge for them, and kicking them when they're down. There's no question that coal has a role to play in our future energy mix. There's no question that we can't do a better job of both mining and using coal. But I think what you're seeing in the disruption of our energy mix and the policy initiatives whether good or bad, to try to move us more to a renewable platform, is you're going to see some structural changes in how the energy grid works. You're going to see some real challenges in being able to finance just the kinds of power lines that you need to get fuel from here to there. But in the long haul, I think there will be a move back to a more sensible mix. There is a future for all of our fuels, and I think eventually, this will come back. Now, is it going to be the normal kind of cycle that we see in commodities? Normally, a business cycle is about a 5-year cycle. Commodities typically are around 7 to 10 years. If you look in Wyoming's history, it's been around those 7 to 10 years that we've seen the depressed prices before they've come back. So we've got a long haul. But for the economy of the country, and particularly for this region, it's been a dramatic hit. And we're starting to see that affect manufacturing. We're starting to see that affect jobs. And this isn't only in Wyoming. It's Alaska, it's Oklahoma, it's North Dakota, it's New Mexico, it's even Colorado. So these are going to be a little bit tougher times ahead. This administration, if you remember, when Obama came to office, he was saying, if this is a nation that can put a man in a moon, on the moon in 7 years, we can certainly learn how to burn coal cleanly. And then has proceeded to sort of say that coal's done. It's a part of ancient history. And you look at what's going on in China. Of course, there's a lot of conversation about the coal use in China. But what's most important about China is that China hasn't sat still. And our country has just sat still and put our sort of pointed towards having this future that's going to be all alternatives. Ever since I was appointed treasurer, one of the big challenges has been, what do you do with these capital gains? And the capital gains have been $300, $400, $500 million. They've been extraordinary boosts to, last year I think all told with everything we made over $1 billion for the state. And people get used to that. Now if you look at more like an endowment model, and I really talk about this from the perspective of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, an endowment only spends a portion of, and actually last year I think we had a law that passed that said trustees of an endowment or a trust fund have the opportunity to make a judgment about how much of the capital gains will be credited to the corpus of the fund and how much can be spent. We need to put that kind of filter on how we've spent these, because we went on a spending bender this last year. Really, we need to reverse that. We need to say, we'll give you a percentage, say 4%, 5%. The rest of that capital gains goes back to grow the fund. That will eventually begin to grow the income stream that the state gets. That's the crisis we have right now. That's the opportunity we have to make good policy out of this.
Changes to the state's energy industry have hit Wyoming hard. And coal, which has outsized influence on jobs, revenue, and culture, is in the midst of the largest transition since production took off in the 1970s. So what happened to coal? How did the industry get to the point where companies are declaring bankruptcy and demand is in steady decline? These are polarizing questions with plenty of political finger-pointing.
A war on coal is a war on middle-class Americans.
He'll keep his war on coal going.
This Kentucky congressman says the federal government has singled out and punished the coal industry.
And literally bankrupted many of these companies. And I don't understand it for a variety of reasons.
Okay, so let's dig into coal's complex decline and try to understand it, starting first with this basic fact.
Certainly, if you want to do something about climate change, you have to do something about CO2 emissions. Coal's the natural first thing that you go after. It's the low-hanging fruit.
The war on coal is basically a perception that federal actions are killing the coal industry. from tax credits for wind and solar to regulations requiring power plants to reduce emissions of toxic air pollutants like mercury and arsenic. And then there's the Clean Power Plan.
A plan 2 years in the making, and the single most important step America has ever taken in the fight against global climate change.
It's the first ever federal rule to limit carbon emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. It's all contributed to a strong feeling in coal communities that the president is out to destroy them.
Any war draws sides. And so you're either for it or you're against it. And I think maybe a war on coal is a bit of a misnomer, because a lot of people who are, even working in the coal industry, are concerned about climate change. But certainly any regulation that affects coal will hurt people who are involved with coal. And that's the first target.
The Energy Information Administration estimates that U.S. coal production in 2015 will be 10% lower than the year before. Regulations do play a role, but that's not the whole story. Declining demand, coupled with the dramatic collapse of the coal industry, is a result of a perfect storm of factors. Like low natural gas prices. Coal analyst James Stevenson says we cannot overstate the importance of this.
We really can't. Natural gas has been a real game changer in North America. It's driven low power prices.
Here in the U.S., hydraulic fracturing technology
allowed extraction of natural gas in new ways that have turned out to be very cheap, that can outcompete a lot of coal.
With the glut of so much more natural gas on the market, its price has come way down, around half of what it was 2 years ago. And the price of renewables is coming down too, but that's not all. Over the past year, a string of coal giants have declared bankruptcy, in part because of bad debt.
The big bet they made was they would be exporting coal to other countries for booming economies. So what happened was in 2010, 2011, if people think back that far, they remember China was growing 10, 11%, Southeast Asia was growing leaps and bounds. And when you have a lot of electricity growth over there means buildings.
And buildings require steel. So in the early 2000s, coal companies invested heavily in metallurgical coal, which is used to make steel.
And that growth never occurred. So now they have a lot of debt that they have to pay down, and the markets are soft.
In the end, when it comes to demand for coal and the companies that supply it, utilities are the ones looking at all of these market factors and then making decisions about the future.
This is pretty much where the coal comes into our facility.
Black Hills Energy is a utility serving Wyoming, Colorado, and a handful of Midwestern states. It owns this coal-fired power plant and the coal mine next door. When the power plant was built back in 2010, around 40% of the cost, $100 million, was spent on pollution controls housed in this massive structure shown here. But this is not the company's model going forward.
We would like to build new coal-fired generation. We believe in coal, but under current rules, no, it would not be cost-effective for our customers.
In 2011, over half of Black Hills' total capacity came from coal. Today, it's down to around 35%. Over the past few years, the company has shut 4 coal-fired power plants.
Those plants were old enough, small enough.
In Wyoming, Colorado, and South Dakota.
Even we are switching to natural gas as a utility, despite the fact that we have that low-cost fuel essentially in our backyard.
The company is even in the midst of acquiring Source Gas, a natural gas company serving nearly 500,000 customers in 4 states. As the coal industry struggles, the low price of natural gas,
You might argue it's a Band-Aid on what otherwise might have been a pretty oblique perspective or view for customers in terms of their rates.
But for many coal communities, things already look bleak. Bev Bauman and Rick Swanson have been mining coal for decades. It's been good pay, steady work, and it's how they met.
Fact is, when we finally got married, people go, "You did? I thought you guys were going to stay shacked up forever."
It's been a good life for them, along with their friends and family, in the energy boom town of Gillette. But things are changing. I asked what would happen if coal went away.
We would look like West Virginia. There would be no work.
I don't think the people around here really know what it's like to be hungry without a job.
Despite major shifts in the industry and serious worries in coal communities, today, coal still supplies nearly 40% of our electricity. And according to the Bureau of Land Management, 1 out of every 5 homes and businesses in the U.S. uses electricity made from Wyoming coal. But when it comes to the future of coal, and of oil for that matter, what does it look like in a world where there is increasing pressure to keep fossil fuels in the ground and emissions out of the air? For regions that have historically been dependent on jobs and revenue from coal and oil extraction, innovation is key. Ideas like clean coal, carbon sequestration, carbon utilization are what we'll look at next. These are some of the potentially game-changing technologies aimed at saving an industry while reducing emissions. China is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world and the largest consumer of coal by far. So figuring out how to keep using the fossil fuel while releasing less CO2 is important there. I traveled to China last year with the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. The Wyoming group has been working to encourage collaboration on low-carbon technology for over a decade.
And we're doing it because we share a common challenge, and that's the challenge of global climate change.
It was a week full of meetings with local government agencies, tours like this one of a state-of-the-art coal-fired power plant, and a global meeting on carbon. It all took place in coal-rich Shanxi province.
We in Wyoming and the people in this province in China, Shanxi province, have a particularly acute challenge.
Because Wyoming produces more coal than any other U.S. state, and Shanxi is one of the top producers in China. Taken together, in 2014, the regions produced more than 1.3 billion tons of coal.
That's a lot of coal, that's a lot of carbon emissions.
On this day, we visited a demonstration facility that turns coal into liquids like diesel and ammonia.
But it's more liquefaction.
The vast energy campus, shown in intricate detail in this model, is essentially an experiment in what you can make from coal and how best to do it. Because turning coal into products generally requires a lot of energy and can be very polluting. Our translator told me that they're experimenting with recycling wastewater and using CO2 in-house rather than emitting it into the atmosphere. Whatever works here and is cost-effective will likely get incorporated into a much larger, yet-to-be-built commercial venture.
It's quite an incredible demonstration facility, and I've not seen anything like this anywhere.
Wyoming is also tackling the issue in part with a $15 million investment in a yet-to-be-built carbon testing lab.
I can't wait to see what great minds come up with to reimagine CO2.
The Integrated Test Center, ITC for short, will be a space for researchers to come up with commercial uses for CO2 generated by coal-fired power plants. For energy-rich regions, this is all part of a technological holy grail of reducing emissions while keeping the coal industry alive. It's called carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
That's the technology that needs to be put on steroids because we're running out of time.
Carbon capture technology can remove emissions right out of a power plant's smokestack. The CO2 can then be stored underground or, in some cases, used to make carbon-based products. The whole suite of technologies taken together is referred to as CCUS. In a joint statement issued during a meeting in September between President Obama and China's President Xi Jinping, the two countries announced a site for a joint CCUS project. According to the Global CCS Institute, a group that advocates for this technology, there are 15 large-scale CCS projects in operation around the world and 7 more under construction. But one serious barrier to attaching CCS to a power plant? Cost. The Boundary Dam carbon capture project in Saskatchewan, Canada, for example, cost around $1 billion and has faced serious delays and operating issues.
We need to spend a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of time, but we don't have that kind of time.
Much of the world will likely continue to rely heavily on coal for quite some time. Although we're using less and less of it here at home, the Energy Information Administration predicts that in 2030, coal will still provide around 25% of our electricity, down from 40% today.
And we can't keep talking about it as if we can simply go to something else. Now, maybe we have the luxury to do that in the United States, but China doesn't have the luxury to do that. I don't think China has the intention of doing that. Those who are serious about climate change have to be serious about the technology that needs to be developed to capture CO2 from the use of coal.
But not everyone agrees. Connie WILBERT is a lifelong Wyoming resident, outdoor enthusiast, and the director of the Sierra Club's Wyoming chapter.
Basically, there is no such thing as clean coal. Talking about clean coal is like talking about healthy tobacco. It doesn't exist.
But carbon capture does. It's just that the way WILBERT and others see it, developing the technology isn't worth the cost.
We think that we would be way better off to be looking for other solutions to help Wyoming and the rest of the country transition to clean, renewable energy sources.
But renewables don't generate revenue in the same way as fossil fuels. In 2016, coal, oil, and gas together are projected to account for around 70% of Wyoming's budget.
Wyoming is facing really, really big challenges, and it's going to be a very difficult transition. That said, we absolutely believe that we don't have a choice. We have to move away from fossil fuels.
But moving away from fossil fuels is exactly what so many in Wyoming are hoping does not happen. And in Representative Dave Miller's view, there is only one way that Wyoming coal can recover, and it's not through technological innovation. The one way, he says,
is an administration change. If we get the different party in the White House, I think we could have a turnaround in 3 or 4 years, and maybe coal production will stabilize. I don't know if it'll get back to where we were a few years ago, but I think it'll at least stabilize and possibly go back up.
But looking back, in terms of revenue, coal's big year was in 2011, when mineral severance taxes from coal totaled $294 million. In 2016, that's projected to go down 12.6%. Now, for more on what's happening today in the oil industry and how this downturn compares with previous busts, I sat down with two Wyoming brothers who have basically seen it all. How long have you been in the oil business?
Quite a while. Functionally all of our lives, quite honestly. We were born and raised in it.
Wyoming has been part and parcel of the oil industry and the gas industry for for decades and decades.
Our production did slide significantly starting in the 70s and on into the 80s and 90s.
So what were those turbulent times like for business?
Well, if you're patient, you're going to see what they're like here in just a few years, unfortunately. But they were tough. Going the late 70s, very early 80s, it was a wonderful boom era. Things were going along unbelievably quick-paced. And then all of a sudden, you sort of hit that brick wall. I think this feels more like it did in the 80s and early 90s, where that bust was truly driven by oversupply. And the industry worldwide created more supply than demand. Whereas I think the crash in 2008, which quite honestly historically was very short, that crash was created by a reduction of demand. So I think we're in for a bit of a siege now, whether that's 3 years, whether it's 5 years, or whether it's 10 years. My crystal ball doesn't go out that far.
I'm very concerned because we have, as David L. said, we have rigs on the grass. We have trucks that are backed up to the fence that are not operating, not doing what they're designed to do. And we have room in the pipeline to move more barrels. So our operations, while they're still functional, we're having to economize on that.
During the booms, quite honestly, we're probably not as efficient economically as we should be. But during these periods, we become very focused on being expense driven.
We're learning to live with $30 crude oil. And if we learn to live with $30 crude oil, then we can take advantage of the increase in price when and if it comes about.
Samuel Western spends his days near Sheridan, writing in his tiny office on wheels outside of his home, where he enjoys the picturesque views of the Bighorn Mountains. He's thought a lot about Wyoming, where we've been, and where we're going. Samuel Western, he's a writer who specializes in economic history, and he's also an author. Samuel, it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wyoming Chronicle.
It's a pleasure to be here.
First, I'd like to talk about your thoughts on Wyoming's economy today. You've written that you hesitate to use the word crisis. You perhaps don't like what it invokes, but many people believe Wyoming's in a budget crisis now. Millions of dollars of budget shortfalls with the decline in the energy industry. What are your thoughts on Wyoming's economy today? Are we in crisis?
No, I don't think we're in crisis. And this is hardly an original example, but it's when former Governor Stan Hathaway goes to his office one morning and finds out that he has $100 in the general fund. That's a crisis. We have a permanent mineral trust fund of $7 billion. We have a rainy day fund of, I think it's $1.8 billion. We're in trouble, but that's not a crisis.
If you were to sit down with legislators or to civic leaders in Wyoming, what would you tell them that Wyoming really needs to consider now, with its budget situation as it is, to look to the future?
I think a couple things have to happen. One, on a systemic level, we need to have a discussion. I've thought about this for a long time, that when oil prices are on top, we need to have a discussion about what do we want to do when oil prices are down? Or where are we going to take this money? Where are we going to spend the money that we have, the surplus? And when North Dakota, which is has a history not dissimilar, it is different in some parts, when their revenues were up, when agriculture was up, when the Bakken was really booming, they were pumping money into their law school, their medical school, into the School of Atmospheric Sciences that were utterly unrelated to extractive industries. We need to have a conversation, a statewide conversation. I think there's a lot of things we could do that I think I would categorize them as hitting singles and doubles. They're not home run strategies. Wyoming is a conservative place. We move slowly, iteration to iteration. I would concentrate on what can we do to help the 19 to 34-year-old demographic. The 19 to 34-year-old demographic is the toughest for any rural state to keep. It doesn't matter if it's North Dakota, Alaska, Maine, parts of Texas. That demographic is when people get out of college, or not even college. They get married, they have families, they want jobs. What's the biggest challenge right now? Getting a house. Why don't we have a tax credit for the 19 to 34-year-old demographic that wants to buy a home or a condo within an incorporated area of Wyoming? Not in the county, but within a city. And the WCDA, that's the Wyoming Community Development Authority, already has programs like this. They have a new home buyer program. But you have to be associated, you have to be approved by the VA or the Farmers Home Administration. I would suggest we do it on our own. Another very simple thing to do was, in fact, when I was doing some work for the WCDA 5 or 6 years ago, I was struck by, when I was interviewing people, the number of young families that needed childcare. If you talk to any young family with 2 working parents, one of the biggest issues they have is childcare. Who can afford it? And the state of Wyoming has long resisted any sort of state support for childcare, though social services has some, because it would be social engineering. I reject that thesis. I think probably the best thing we could do for young families would be to help them with childcare, either directly or indirectly. But it enables that demographic to stay here and live here and prosper.